My name is Noah. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe as steady. Not loud, not flashy. The one who shows up early, leaves late, remembers birthdays without reminders, and doesn't need to be seen to feel useful. Or at least, that's what I used to tell myself. If you asked people who know me casually, they'd probably say I'm dependable, maybe even a little predictable. The safe choice. The guy who listens more than he speaks. I've learned that when you move through the world quietly, people tend to project their own assumptions onto you. They think silence means simplicity, that calm means compliance, that patience means you'll always wait. This story isn't about rage or revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or proving I was right all along. It's about awareness, about what happens when you slowly realize that the life you're protecting is quietly placing you second without ever saying so out loud. I was married. I believed in the vows, not in a dramatic movie scene way, but in the everyday sense. Choosing someone even when it's inconvenient, staying when things feel dull, trusting that loyalty is mutual. I thought I was building something solid. What I didn't know, what I would eventually find out, was that I wasn't the first choice in my own marriage. I was the backup plan, not in a cruel, obvious way. There were no shouting matches, no obvious betrayals at first, just absences that didn't make sense. Emotional gaps are explained away as stress, comparisons that were never said directly but always felt. She stayed with me, while waiting for someone else. Someone from the past. Someone who represented a life that didn't quite work out, but wasn't fully let go of either. This story is about how that truth revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, about the small moments that didn't add up, the way I learned to observe instead of react. How silence, for the first time in my life, became a choice rather than a default. You won't hear dramatic confrontations here. No explosive arguments, no public humiliation. What you will hear is the internal shift that happens when you stop begging to be chosen and start choosing yourself, quietly. I'm telling this story honestly, not because I want sympathy, but because I know how many people live inside similar questions without language for them. How many stay because nothing feels bad enough to leave, while something inside them is slowly being erased. If you've ever felt like the stable option instead of the desired one, if you've ever wondered whether loyalty is being mistaken for convenience, then maybe this story will feel familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently, without judgment. Have you ever stayed in a relationship where you were present, but not truly chosen? To understand how I became the backup plan, you first need to understand who I was to them. I wasn't the exciting choice. I was the reliable one, the one who made life easier. In social settings, I was often described indirectly, not by my ambitions or opinions, but by my usefulness. Noah will handle it. Ask Noah, he's good with that. He doesn't mind. That last one came up more than people realize. It was never said with malice, just certainty. In my marriage, I played the same role. I was the calm center, the one who remembered bills, schedules, and long-term plans. I didn't demand emotional reassurance because I believed presence was enough. I thought consistency spoke louder than intensity. And for a long time, everyone seemed comfortable with that arrangement. When my partner talked about me to others, it was always in terms of safety. I was solid, trustworthy, not dramatic. Compliments that sounded positive, but never felt personal. I didn't notice it at first because I'd been praised that way my whole life. Teachers liked me. Managers relied on me. Friends leaned on me. I had learned early that being low friction made you indispensable. What I didn't realize was that indispensability and desire are not the same thing. In conversations, I was often the listener, not because I lacked things to say, but because people rarely paused long enough to ask. When decisions were made, I was consulted after the emotional momentum had already moved. My role was to agree, refine, or support, not to initiate. And I accepted that, because I told myself I didn't need to be the center. That maturity meant not needing validation. That love was proven through consistency, not excitement. But looking back now, there were signs of invisibility that I normalized. At dinners with friends, stories about my partner's past always carried more energy than stories about our present. Certain names sparked liveliness. Certain memories were told with a softness I didn't recognize. I was sitting right there, holding the glass, smiling politely, while parts of their emotional world seemed oriented somewhere else. I wasn't excluded. I was included functionally. When stress hit, I was the solution. When comfort was needed, I was dependable. But when joy appeared unexpectedly, when curiosity or nostalgia surfaced, it didn't move toward me. It moved around me. I don't say that bitterly, just precisely. People didn't mistreat me. They just assumed I'd always be there. That assumption shaped everything. My opinions carried weight only when they aligned. My silence was interpreted as agreement. My patience was mistaken for infinite capacity. I became the man you build stability on, not the man you look toward. And the most subtle part, I helped reinforce it. I rarely corrected assumptions. I didn't interrupt emotional momentum to ask for clarity. I believed that if something mattered, it would be offered freely. I thought asking to be prioritized would cheapen the act itself. So I stayed composed. I stayed helpful. I stayed quiet. Inside, I told myself I was choosing peace. But what I was really choosing was familiarity, because it felt safer than confronting the possibility that I was valued for what I provided, not for who I was. If someone had asked me back then whether I felt unseen, I would have said no. I would have said everything was fine. Those relationships go through phases. That is not everything that needs analysis. That was true until it wasn't. Because invisibility doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in gently. It disguises itself as trust, as comfort, as this is just how things are. And when you are the person everyone relies on, no one thinks to check whether you're still being chosen, including you. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's what made it dangerous. It was ordinary, too ordinary to resist or argue with. A sentence said casually, without tension. The kind of thing people say when they assume you won't mind. We were sitting in this car, parked outside a grocery store. I remember that detail clearly, not because it mattered, but because everything else felt so neutral. The engine was off. The radio was low. I had just finished asking whether we still wanted to cook dinner together that night. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they sighed softly and said, almost to themselves, "You know, sometimes I wonder how different things would have been if I had stayed with him." No anger, no comparison, just reflection. I smiled slightly, the way you do when you're not sure whether something is meant to be shared or corrected. I waited for context, for reassurance, for the follow-up that says, "But this, us, is what I want." It didn't come. They reached for their phone, already somewhere else mentally, and said, "Anyway, let's just grab something quick." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had just been placed between us. The moment passed, sealed by convenience. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People have pasts. Curiosity isn't betrayal. I didn't want to be the insecure husband who polices thoughts that weren't acted on. But something inside me registered it. Not emotionally, structurally, like a hairline crack in glass. You don't panic. You just notice the pattern. After that, there were tiny adjustments I couldn't unsee. Certain names started appearing more often in conversation, always framed as a coincidence, as updates, as nostalgia with no agenda. When they spoke about that person, their tone changed, lighter, more animated. When they spoke about us, it was logistical. I didn't confront it. I didn't ask questions that would force an answer neither of us was ready to hear. Instead, I paid attention. The next small cut came during a group dinner. Someone asked how long we'd been married. Before I could answer, my partner laughed lightly and said, "Long enough to know stability matters more than sparks." Everyone nodded. Someone joked about maturity. The conversation moved on. I laughed too, because laughing kept things smooth. But inside, something shifted. Not pain, clarity. Stability was something you settled into. Sparks were something you missed. I began noticing how often I was framed as the solution to life, not the desire in it. How compliments about me always involved endurance, patience, or reliability, never longing. Still, I said nothing, because the cuts were small, individually harmless. Each one is easy to rationalize away, and because calling attention to them would have required admitting something uncomfortable, that I might not be the first choice emotionally, even if I was the chosen structure. That realization takes time. It arrives only after repetition. But this was the first time I felt it, not as insecurity, but as information. That night, lying in a bed, I stared at the ceiling longer than usual. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was recalibrating. I asked myself a quiet question I had never asked before. If I stopped being useful, would I still be wanted? I didn't answer it. I didn't need to yet. The question itself was enough to change how I listened going forward. From that moment on, I didn't just hear words. I noticed what wasn't followed up on, what wasn't reassured, what wasn't protected. People reveal priorities not through declarations, but through what they assume doesn't need care. And that night, without realizing it, I stopped assuming I was the priority. I started watching instead. Once you notice the first cut, you begin to see how easily it blends into the rest of the pattern. Nothing dramatic changed after that night. That's the part people misunderstand. Disrespect doesn't always escalate. Sometimes it stabilizes, quietly, until it becomes the new baseline. I didn't wake up thinking, I'm being taken for granted. I woke up thinking, this is just a phase. That belief became my shield. The comments continued, subtle and well-packaged. Comparisons disguised as observations. Emotional distance is explained as fatigue. When I asked how their day was, the answer was brief. When someone from their past messaged them, the conversation lasted longer. I told myself I was being paranoid, that adulthood is quieter, that passion evolves into a partnership. And yet, when I spoke about our future plans, ideas, and dreams, it felt like I was presenting proposals, not sharing visions. They listened politely. They nodded, but nothing lit up. Meanwhile, references to what could have been appeared casually, never directed at me, never framed as regret, just hovering, like an alternate timeline kept alive through conversation. I didn't challenge it because challenging it would have required asking for reassurance, and I had spent years building an identity around not needing that. So I adapted. I became more accommodating. I gave more space. I reduced my expectations without admitting I was doing so. I convinced myself this was maturity, choosing peace over conflict. But peace without mutual care isn't peace. It's avoidance. I remember one evening clearly. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. Same room, different worlds. I reached for their hand without thinking. They didn't pull away, but they didn't respond either. Their hand stayed limp in mine until I let go. They didn't notice. That's when I understood something important. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's just the absence of presence. Still, I stayed quiet, because there were good days. Laughter over shared jokes. Comfortable routines. Moments where things felt almost normal. Those moments became my evidence that nothing was wrong. I clung to them like proof. But over time, I realized I was doing most of the emotional maintenance alone. I was the one adjusting the tone, timing, expectations. I was the one making sure conversations didn't drift into uncomfortable territory. I was protecting not the relationship, but the illusion that it was balanced. And slowly, my silence trained everyone around me. It taught them that I would absorb discomfort without naming it, that I would reinterpret slights as misunderstandings, that I would continue functioning regardless of emotional return. Once people learned that, they stopped checking. The most dangerous part wasn't what they did, it was what I excused. I told myself love didn't need constant affirmation, that desire fades, but loyalty remains, that being chosen once should be enough. But deep down, a quieter truth was forming. I was still being chosen, just not first. I was the option that made sense, the stable path, the life that worked. And while I managed the present, part of their heart stayed elsewhere, waiting, comparing, remembering. I didn't confront them because I didn't want to be the man who begged for attention. I didn't want to turn emotional distance into an argument. I thought dignity meant endurance, so I normalized it. I normalized being the last to know. I normalized being emotionally self-sufficient in a partnership. I normalized being appreciated for what I provided, not how I was desired. And the more I normalized it, the less anyone questioned it, including me. But normalization has a cost. Every time you shrink your expectations, something inside you learns not to reach anymore. You stop initiating. You stop sharing fully. You become efficient instead of expressive. You become useful. And once you are useful, people forget you might also need to be chosen. I didn't realize it then, but this was the phase where the relationship stopped being mutual and started being managed by me. And management, no matter how skilled, is not the same as love. There comes a moment when patterns stop feeling coincidental and start feeling instructional. I didn't wake up one day and suddenly understand my role. It unfolded through repetition, through how people spoke around me rather than to me, through expectations that were never discussed, only assumed. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the emotional shock absorber. When something went wrong, eyes turned to me, not for comfort, but for solutions. I was expected to remain composed, to translate emotion into logistics, chaos into calm. And I did it well. Too well. That competence became my identity. In conversations about our lives, I noticed I was rarely asked what I wanted. Instead, I was told what was needed, and my agreement was assumed. If I hesitated, the silence felt awkward, as if I had momentarily forgotten my lines. I wasn't punished for dissent. I was simply bypassed. Decisions would be made emotionally, then handed to me for execution. Plans formed elsewhere, finalized through me. I became the structure that allowed others to feel free. And the strangest part? No one thought they were being unfair. Because I never objected. When people don't resist a role, it hardens. I saw it clearly during a conversation with my partner one afternoon. They were talking about the future, career shifts, location changes, lifestyle ideas. I listened, asked clarifying questions, and offered practical input. At some point, I asked calmly, "And where do you see me in all of that?" They paused, not because the question was difficult, but because it hadn't been considered. "Oh," they said after a moment, "you'll be fine wherever. You always adapt." It wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant as praise. But that sentence revealed everything. I wasn't being envisioned. I was being accommodated. I realized then that my role was not a partner in direction. It was a support system. I was the constant variable, the known quantity. Others could explore, reminisce, or hesitate. I would remain steady. That's when it clicked. I wasn't competing with anyone. I was filling the space that allowed competition to remain hypothetical. The past person, the one who lingered emotionally, represented excitement, possibility, unfinished business. I represented resolution, stability, closure. And people don't long for closure. They rely on it. I had been assigned the role of good enough to stay, not because I lacked value, but because my value was too predictable. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how emotional labor flowed in one direction, how I was expected to regulate not only myself, but also the relationship, how my calm was used as evidence that everything was okay, even when it wasn't. I was the man you don't worry about losing, and that's a dangerous place to live. Because when someone believes you'll always be there, they stop choosing you actively. They choose you passively. By default. I didn't feel angry about it. I felt clarified. Roles exist in every relationship. Some are negotiated. Others are assumed. Mine had been assumed and reinforced by my silence. And here's the part that mattered most. No one assigned it maliciously. They assigned it because I made it easy. Because I didn't interrupt emotional comfort with uncomfortable truths. Because I valued harmony over honesty. Because I believed that asking to be prioritized would diminish the sincerity of the act. But roles don't change on their own. They change only when the person playing them stops performing. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I did. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a confession or a discovery or some cinematic moment where everything suddenly made sense. It happened on a quiet afternoon when nothing was technically wrong. I was alone at home, sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Not intentionally, just drifting. Past vacations, early days, smiles that looked effortless back then. What struck me wasn't nostalgia, it was asymmetry. In almost every photo, I was angled toward them, leaning in, attentive, present. In many of the more recent ones, they were angled slightly away, subtle, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. I wasn't looking for proof. I wasn't building a case. I was just noticing. And in that noticing, something inside me relaxed for the first time in a long while. Not because I felt validated, but because I stopped resisting the truth. I realized I had been spending an enormous amount of energy maintaining an emotional equilibrium that wasn't mutual. I had been compensating, filling gaps, translating silence into patience. And the moment I stopped telling myself a story about it, this is normal, this is mature, this is temporary, the exhaustion surfaced. I wasn't tired of the relationship. I was tired of performing stability alone. That afternoon, my partner came home later than expected. They mentioned running into someone unexpectedly. A familiar name, said casually. No tension. I nodded, listened, asked how it was. They talked longer than usual, and I noticed something remarkable. I felt nothing. No jealousy, no anxiety, just a quiet confirmation of what I already knew. That's when the shift was completed. I understood that my silence up to that point hadn't been strong. It had been an avoidance of my own clarity. For years, I thought the most dignified thing was to stay composed, to not ask questions that might destabilize things, to trust that consistency would be reciprocated. But dignity isn't silence at the cost of self-respect. That day, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance. I just stopped lying to myself. I acknowledged fully and without emotion that I was not the emotional first choice in my own marriage, that I was the safe harbor while someone else remained in the open sea. And instead of reacting, something else happened. I became still, not passive, not numb. Still, in the way a person becomes when they stop chasing explanations and start observing reality. I stopped initiating emotional repairs. I stopped smoothing over awkwardness. I stopped interpreting half-presence as enough. I didn't announce this change. I didn't need to. Internally, a boundary had formed. That boundary wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was clarity. For the first time, I asked myself a different question. Not, how do I fix this? But what does this ask of me? And the answer wasn't confrontation. It was patience. Because once you see a pattern clearly, You don't need to rush. You let it reveal itself fully. You give it space to be exactly what it is. That afternoon marked the end of my confusion. Not the end of the marriage, not yet, but the end of my denial. And when denial ends, something else begins. Quietly, invisibly, but decisively. Choice. After that day, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit shaped by years of choosing harmony. Now, it was intentional. I didn't withdraw. I didn't punish. I didn't grow cold. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still showed up, still handled responsibilities, still listened when spoken to. But internally, I stopped filling in emotional blanks that weren't mine to fill. When conversations drifted toward nostalgia, I didn't redirect them or soothe the air afterward. I let them end where they naturally fell. When emotional distance appeared, I didn't rush to close it. I noted it. This wasn't a tactic designed to provoke. It was an experiment in reality. I wanted to see what happened when I stopped compensating. What happened was revealing. Silence, when chosen, acts like a mirror. It reflects patterns back to the people creating them. But most people don't recognize mirrors. They just feel the absence of cushioning. At first, nothing obvious changed, which told me everything I needed to know. No one asked if I was okay. No one noticed the emotional labor I'd quietly set down. The relationship continued on its familiar track, powered by inertia. That confirmed something important. My effort had been essential, but invisible. As weeks passed, subtle reactions began to surface. I was told I seemed distracted, that I was less expressive. Not in concern, more in mild inconvenience. As if a familiar function wasn't operating at full efficiency. I listened without defending myself, because defending would have required explaining a truth they weren't ready to hear. My calm unsettled people. Not because it was new, but because it was no longer smoothing things over. I wasn't withholding. I was conserving. I paid attention to how often my silence was interpreted as agreement, how assumptions were made without confirmation, how plans continued to include me as infrastructure, not as an emotional participant. No one asked what I needed. That was the point. Silence stopped being something done to me and became something I used. Not as a weapon, but as a filter. It filtered out projections. It filtered out narratives I had been quietly supporting, and it showed me how much of the relationship's stability had depended on my unspoken labor. There was a moment, small but decisive, when my partner said, "You've been really understanding lately." I nodded. What they meant was, "You haven't been asking questions." They mistook my stillness for acceptance, for maturity, for the same old pattern, and I let them, because I wasn't ready to change the outcome yet. I was still gathering information. Silence, when intentional, buys you time. Time to observe without interference. Time to let people behave naturally when they think nothing is wrong. And when people think nothing is wrong, they reveal what they think is normal. I noticed how quickly my emotional presence was taken for granted, how easily I could be assumed, scheduled, leaned on, without being checked in on. I wasn't offended by it anymore. I was documenting it, not in writing, in memory, in clarity. This phase taught me something critical. If you stop holding something up and it begins to wobble, it was never self-supporting. And yet, I didn't confront. I didn't demand. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically. Because confrontation would have turned this into an argument about feelings. And this wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about structure, about who carries what, about who is seen and who is assumed, about what happens when the person who always absorbs pressure quietly steps back without announcement. Most people don't notice silence when it begins. They notice it only when its absence creates discomfort. And that discomfort was coming. While everything looked the same on the surface, something fundamental had already changed underneath. What they never noticed was that my attention had shifted direction. Before, my awareness was outward, monitoring moods, anticipating needs, smoothing transitions. Now, it turned inward and forward, quietly, methodically. I didn't announce a new phase of my life. I didn't create distance or drama that would trigger concern. I simply stopped orienting myself around being needed. Instead, I started observing systems. I paid attention to how our finances actually functioned, who paid what, who depended on which accounts, what assumptions were baked into our shared life. I wasn't suspicious. I was precise. There's a difference. I revisited documents I hadn't looked at in years, not with urgency, but with curiosity. Marriage papers, insurance, savings, timelines. I wanted to understand the architecture of the life we had built, not emotionally, but structurally. I noticed how much of it relied on my consistency. At the same time, I began reclaiming parts of myself that had gone dormant. Not dramatically. No sudden transformations, just small, disciplined shifts. I stayed later at work, not to escape, but to focus. I took on projects that required long-term thinking, projects that rewarded pattern recognition and patience. I didn't tell anyone why I was suddenly more engaged. I didn't need to. I started documenting, not evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of reality. Conversations remembered accurately. Commitments made and postponed. Emotional investments are given unevenly. Clarity has a way of accumulating when you stop interrupting it with hope. What surprised me most was how invisible this preparation was. Because I wasn't angry. Anger draws attentions. Anger demands a reaction. Calm planning does neither. At home, I remained steady, predictable. I didn't withhold kindness. I didn't provoke guilt. I simply stopped over-functioning emotionally. And because I wasn't reacting, no one adjusted. That's what people miss about quiet people. When we stop reacting, it doesn't look like change. It looks like compliance. Meanwhile, I was learning. I learned how often people confuse patience with permanence, how they interpret calm as consent, how rarely does anyone check the foundation of something that's never shaken. I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. I had been complicit in my own invisibility, not because I lacked courage, but because I believed that being chosen should never require explanation. That belief had kept me silent long past the point where silence served me. But now silence was serving me differently. I wasn't preparing to punish anyone. I wasn't planning a reveal. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic turning point. I was preparing for alignment, for the possibility that the life I was stabilizing was not the life I was meant to continue inhabiting. And I did it without rushing, because urgency clouds judgment. I let time do its work. I watched how little effort was made to re-engage me emotionally once I stopped initiating. How easily my steadiness was taken as evidence that everything was fine. I watched how emotional energy flowed elsewhere, without secrecy, without shame. Just an assumption. That assumption was the leverage. Not leverage in a manipulative sense, but in a clarifying one. Because when people believe you'll always be there, they reveal exactly how they treat you when they're not afraid of losing you. And what they never noticed was that I was no longer assuming anything. I was positioning myself not against them, but toward my own future. A future that did not depend on being someone's backup plan. And once that positioning began, there was no going back to ignorance, only forward to the decision. The reveal didn't come from a message or a confession or something accidentally left open on a screen. It came from alignment, from watching actions line up so cleanly that explanation became unnecessary. I had already stopped reacting by then, stopped interpreting, stopped translating the meaning where none was offered. I was simply observing, letting reality present itself without interruption. And reality is remarkably honest when you stop negotiating with it. The moment of clarity arrived on an evening that felt unremarkable. We were sitting in the same room, doing separate things. Comfortable silence, the kind that used to reassure me. My partner was texting, smiling occasionally, not hiding it, not protecting the screen, just elsewhere. At one point, they laughed softly, an unguarded sound. Instinctively, I looked up. They didn't notice, and in that instant, something crystallized. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't suspicion, it was recognition. That sound, that ease, wasn't for me anymore, and it hadn't been for a long time. What made this a reveal wasn't the behavior itself. It was the absence of any impulse in me to question it. No urge to ask who they were talking to, no need for reassurance, no tightening in my chest. Just understanding. I finally saw the full picture, not emotionally, but structurally. They hadn't chosen me over someone else. They had chosen me until someone else became possible again. I wasn't the obstacle to desire. I was the placeholder for stability. And once I accepted that, everything made sense retroactively. The way conversations avoid depth, the way future plans felt vague, the way I was included automatically, but rarely considered intentionally. I wasn't being deceived in the traditional sense. I was being deprioritized quietly, while still being relied on fully. That realization didn't hurt the way people imagine betrayal hurts. It clarified. It stripped the situation of emotional noise and left only facts. I understood then that no conversation would change this, not because people are cruel, but because they are comfortable. And comfort rarely motivates honesty. The leverage I discovered wasn't information I could use against them. It was information that freed me from confusion. I finally knew where I stood, not as a victim, not as a competitor, but as a contingency, the safe option that made waiting possible. And with that knowledge came a strange calm. Because once you know the truth without needing validation, you stop chasing explanations. You stop needing apologies. You stop requiring closure from the people who benefited from your silence. That night, I didn't confront them. I didn't withdraw. I didn't change my tone. I went to bed at the same time, said goodnight the same way, kept everything steady. But internally, something irreversible had happened. I no longer needed them to choose me, because I had finally chosen myself with full awareness. And that is a quiet kind of power. Not loud, not dramatic. But finally, from that point forward, every action I took was informed, not by hope, but by clarity. And clarity doesn't rush. It prepares. Knowing the truth is not the same as acting on it. There's a space between awareness and movement, a quiet, dangerous space where most people get stuck. They know enough to feel uncomfortable, but not enough to leave. They hover there, hoping clarity will somehow dissolve back into comfort. I didn't want to live there. Once I understood my position clearly, I gave myself time, not to doubt it, but to explore my options honestly, not emotionally, strategically. There were several paths I could have taken. I could have confronted them, asked the questions I had been avoiding, forced the situation into the open. That path promised temporary relief, maybe even reassurance, but at the cost of truth, because reassurance given under pressure is not the same as being chosen freely. I could have stayed silent indefinitely, continued playing the role, allowed stability to outweigh desire. That path promised familiarity, but demanded that I keep shrinking myself to maintain it. Or I could choose the option that felt hardest, not because it was dramatic, but because it was final. I could exit quietly, not abruptly, not cruelly, but deliberately. The decision didn't come with adrenaline. It came with stillness. I asked myself one question, and I didn't allow myself to soften it. If nothing changes, can I respect the man I become by staying? The answer came without emotion. No. That was the moment the decision was made. Not in anger, not in heartbreak, in alignment. I didn't announce it. I didn't start counting days. I simply shifted from observing to preparing with intention. This wasn't about punishment or exposure. I had no interest in being right publicly. I wasn't competing for affection. I was reclaiming authorship over my own life. Leaving, in this context, wasn't running away. It was refusing to remain a placeholder. What made the decision irreversible wasn't paperwork or logistics. It was internal consent. Once I withdrew that, there was nothing left to negotiate. I no longer needed them to change. I no longer needed proof. I no longer needed closure. The moment I accepted that I was not the emotional first choice and that this wasn't a misunderstanding, the relationship, as it had been, was already over. Everything after that would just be execution. The hardest part wasn't choosing to leave. It was choosing not to explain myself prematurely. Because explanations invite bargaining, and bargaining would have dragged me back into a role I had already outgrown. So I stayed calm, present, unremarkable. I let life continue on its usual rhythm while I prepared to step out of it. Not because I was afraid, but because I respected the gravity of the decision. This wasn't about escaping pain. It was about refusing to live in quiet diminishment. And once that refusal settled fully, there was no version of events where I stayed. Only different ways of leaving. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not outwardly, but internally. I didn't rush. I didn't act on impulse. I treated the next phase the way I treat any irreversible process, with patience and precision. This was the part no one notices until it's over. I began separating my life quietly, piece by piece, without creating gaps that would draw attention. I reviewed finances the way someone reviews a system they're about to leave, not with resentment, but with care. I ensured nothing would collapse suddenly. No chaos, no emergencies. I adjusted my routines slightly, subtle enough to feel natural. A different gym schedule. More time at work. A few evenings spent catching up with myself. None of it is suspicious, all of it intentional. I didn't confide in friends, not because I didn't trust them, but because opinions create noise, and I needed clarity. At home, I remained steady. That was the most disarming part. People expect withdrawal before departure. Distance, coldness, signals. I offered none of those. I still listened, still contributed, still participated in shared logistics, but I no longer merged myself emotionally into future plans. When vague ideas came up, I didn't build on them. I let them remain vague. I noticed how easily this went unnoticed, because no one was tracking my internal presence, only my functional one. That told me everything. I prepared documents, timelines, options. I didn't rush legal steps, but I made sure I understood them. I wanted no surprises, especially not emotional ones. This wasn't about protecting assets. It was about protecting dignity. The most difficult part was restraint. There were moments when it would have been easier to speak, to ask, "Do you even see me anymore?" To force a reaction that would validate the decision. But validation wasn't the goal. Alignment was, so I moved silently, not in secrecy, but in self-respect. And as I did, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not because I was leaving, but because I was no longer waiting. Waiting to be chosen, waiting to be prioritized, waiting for someone else's clarity to arrive. That waiting had been the heaviest burden of all. Now, each quiet step forward felt like reclaiming time I hadn't realized I was giving away. There was no countdown, No dramatic turning point, just steady motion away from a life that no longer fits. And still, no one noticed. Because when people assume you're permanent, they stop watching closely. They don't see preparation. They don't hear resolve. They don't sense departure until absence arrives fully formed. I wasn't disappearing. I was detaching, cleanly. And once detachment begins at that level, there is no argument powerful enough to reverse it. Only consequences waiting to unfold. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when you leave quietly. At first, nothing seemed different. The routines held. The house functioned. Life continued with the same rhythm it always had. But underneath, small things started to shift. I began saying no to minor requests, not defensively, not with an explanation, just no, or I can't handle that right now. The first time it happened, my partner looked surprised. Not upset, just momentarily disoriented, like a step missing on a staircase. They recovered quickly. "You've just been busy lately," they said. I didn't correct them. The second time, they hesitated before asking. The third time, they didn't ask at all. That's when the absence began to register, not as loss, but as inconvenience. Tasks I used to handle automatically were left undone longer. Emotional cushioning I used to provide simply wasn't there to absorb friction. Small tensions lingered instead of dissolving. Still, no one connected it to the departure, because people don't recognize withdrawal when it's quiet. They just feel a decrease in support. I noticed frustration surface, not about me, but about circumstances. Things felt harder, less smooth, less reliable. And for the first time, I wasn't compensating. I didn't point it out. I didn't explain what was missing. I let the experience speak. At some point, my partner said, "Things feel off lately." I nodded. "Yeah, sometimes that happens." That was all. They weren't feeling abandonment yet. They were feeling the cost of the assumption. And that cost grows slowly. Emotional labor, once removed, reveals how much weight it carried. They started reaching out more. Not emotionally, logistically. Questions, requests, clarifications. I answered politely, briefly, without overfunctioning. And slowly the dynamic began to tilt. I could sense confusion building. Not panic, not guilt. Confusion. Why did things feel less stable when I was still there? Why did I seem unchanged but less available? Why wasn't I fixing what felt broken? The answer, that I had stopped playing a role, never crossed their mind. Because roles feel like reality until they're gone. I watched this unfold without satisfaction. There was no triumph in it, just confirmation. Confirmation that my presence had been carrying more than anyone realized. Confirmation that my silence had been misread for years. And confirmation that once people feel the loss of something they assumed was permanent, they scramble, not to repair the relationship, but to restore the function. That's an important distinction. They didn't ask how I felt. They asked why things felt different. That told me everything. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were structural. The system was losing a support beam that it didn't know existed. And systems don't grieve. They destabilize. I remained calm through it all. Not distant, not cold. Just no longer compensating for the imbalance. And an imbalance, when left alone, becomes impossible to ignore. The moment they realized something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It came quietly, too quietly to interrupt. By the time concerns surfaced, it had already missed its window. At first, the questions were casual. "Are you okay? You've just seemed different lately." I answered honestly, but not expansively. "I'm fine. I've just been thinking more." Those answers were accurate. They just weren't reassuring. What followed wasn't intimacy, it was diagnostics. They started paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Noticing my schedule, asking where I was going, checking in more often. Small gestures appeared, familiar ones, recycled from earlier years. From the outside, it might have looked like an effort. From the inside, I could feel the timing. This wasn't a desire to return. It was stability being threatened. They weren't trying to reconnect with me. They were trying to restore what they were losing. And the problem with late effort is that it reveals priority retroactively. I didn't reject the gestures. I accepted them politely. I smiled. I stayed composed. But something crucial was missing. Relief. The gestures didn't land because they weren't rooted in choice. They were rooted in alarm. And once you've felt what it's like to be chosen only when absence becomes possible, you can't unfeel it. There was one evening when they sat closer than usual. Their hand reached for mine with intention. They asked questions about my day, real ones. I answered, but inside, I knew. This version of them existed only in response to loss. Not because they were manipulative, but because awareness had arrived too late. You can't unsee the sequence of events once you've seen it clearly. For years, my presence had been assumed. My steadiness is taken as a given. My silence is mistaken for endless tolerance. Now that the ground felt unstable, concern appeared. But concern is not the same as commitment. I wasn't angry about it. I wasn't even disappointed. I was finished. That's the part people misunderstand most about quiet exits. By the time you notice the door closing, the decision has already happened internally. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't lay out grievances. Because at this stage, explaining would have been cruel. Not to them, to me. It would have reopened negotiations I had already resolved. I watched the panic grow subtly. Not fear of losing me, fear of losing certainty, fear of facing the truth that they might have misjudged something they thought was permanent. And permanence, once questioned, creates anxiety. I stayed calm through it all, not out of superiority, but out of finality. There was nothing left to fix because nothing was broken suddenly. It had eroded slowly, quietly, with my consent. And once consent is withdrawn, no amount of late attention can replace years of unchosen presence. They sensed it before they understood it. You can feel when someone is no longer available for persuasion. That's when urgency replaces comfort. But urgency doesn't rebuild trust. It only exposes dependency. By the time they realized what was at stake, the relationship wasn't failing. It had already ended. They just hadn't caught up yet. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no rehearsed speeches waiting for their turn. Just two people sitting across from each other with very different levels of clarity. They were the one who initiated it. "We need to talk," they said carefully. Not defensively, not casually either. There was a tightness in their tone, a recognition that something important had already shifted beyond reach. I nodded. Okay. That alone seemed to unsettle them. They expected resistance, or reassurance, or explanation. What they got was presence, without pursuit. They spoke first, about distance, about feeling me pull away, about how things didn't feel the same and how they didn't understand why. I listened fully. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct framing. I let them finish. When it was my turn, I didn't unload years of stored observations. I didn't list moments. I didn't bring evidence. I said only what was necessary. I realized I was no longer being chosen, I said calmly. I was being relied on. They frowned, confused. That's not true. I chose you. I married you. I nodded again. You chose the life. You chose the stability. But emotionally, I was the backup plan. The room went quiet, not because they were shocked, but because the statement landed cleanly, without blame, without exaggeration. They tried to respond quickly, to explain, to reframe, to say they never meant, "I know," I said gently. "I don't think you were trying to hurt me." That surprised them more than anger would have. They asked questions then, more pointed ones, about when I started feeling this way. Why didn't I say anything sooner? What they could do now? I answered honestly, but narrowly. I didn't say anything because I needed to understand it first, I said, and by the time I did, I knew it wasn't something a conversation could fix. Their face changed at that. Don't panic yet. Something closer to grief. "So what are you saying?" they asked. I didn't rush the answer. "I'm saying I'm done waiting to be chosen," I said, "and I'm not angry about it." That's when the emotion surfaced. For them. Not explosive. Just quiet desperation. They talked about trying harder. About fixing things. About how they didn't realize what they were doing. I believed them. But belief wasn't the issue. Timing was. I listened until they ran out of words. Then I said the hardest truth I had learned. Effort matters most when it's offered freely, not when it's forced by the threat of loss. They asked if there was anything they could say. Anything they could promise. I shook my head. Promises now would only prove what I already know, I said, that I mattered most when I was about to leave. The room felt heavy after that, not with anger, but with finality. There was no shouting, no storming out, just the quiet recognition that something essential had been missed and couldn't be retrieved. I stood up calmly, said I would be staying elsewhere for a while, not as a tactic, as a decision. They didn't stop me, not because they didn't care, but because on some level, they understood. When I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment, and that was enough. Life after leaving didn't arrive with fireworks. It settled in quietly, like a room finally reaching the right temperature after years of imbalance. For a while, everything felt neutral. Not happy, not sad, just accurate. That surprised me. I had expected grief, or anger, or a sudden surge of freedom. Instead, what I felt most was space. Mental space. Emotional space. The kind that allows you to hear your own thoughts without interference. I didn't rush to redefine myself. I didn't reinvent my appearance or narrate a redemption arc. I simply paid attention to who I was when no one was leaning on me, and what I found was reassuring. I was still steady, still observant, still calm, But now, those traits belonged to me, not to a role I was maintaining for someone else. I noticed how different my energy felt when I wasn't anticipating emotional shifts or compensating for absence. How much bandwidth was returned when I wasn't monitoring someone else's attention. I also noticed something subtler. I laughed more easily, not because life had suddenly become lighter, but because I wasn't carrying quite as much disappointment anymore. The part of me that had been bracing for neglect finally relaxed. I reconnected with things I'd set aside unconsciously. Long walks without headphones, reading without distraction, conversations where I didn't feel like I had to perform emotional steadiness. People around me noticed the change before I articulated it. "You seem clearer," someone said once. "Not happier, clearer." That felt accurate. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I didn't feel the need to explain my decision publicly or justify it privately. The people who needed to understand already did. The rest didn't matter. I also reflected honestly on my part in what happened. I saw how my silence had taught others how to treat me, how my avoidance of discomfort had delayed the necessary truth, how being endlessly adaptable had made me invisible. That wasn't self-blame. It was self-responsibility. And responsibility is empowering when it's owned without shame. I didn't harden after the marriage ended. I didn't become suspicious or closed off. If anything, I became more precise. I learned to value mutual presence over convenience, to notice when effort flows in only one direction, to understand that being chosen consistently matters more than being chosen once. I no longer confuse stability with love, and I no longer stay where my presence is assumed rather than appreciated. That's who I am now. Not louder, not colder, just clearer. I still believe in commitment, still value patience, still choose calm over chaos. But I also believe that quiet people deserve to be chosen intentionally, not kept as insurance. And I will never again build a life where my role is to wait. There's a lesson people often misunderstand in stories like this. They think it's about leaving, or about being wronged, or about finally standing up for yourself. But that's not the heart of it. The real lesson is about attention, about what happens when you pay close, honest attention to how you are being treated, and stop editing the truth to make it easier to live with. I didn't leave because someone was cruel. I didn't leave because of one moment or one person from the past. I left because I realized I had slowly agreed to be second in a life where I was giving first. And no amount of patience makes that sustainable. Being the backup plan doesn't always look like betrayal. Sometimes it looks like comfort without curiosity, like being relied on but not reached for, like being assumed but not actively chosen. And the most dangerous part? It can feel normal, especially if you're the kind of person who values calm, loyalty, and endurance. People like us are often praised for being easy to be with. What they don't tell you is that being easy can make it easier for others to stop trying. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human, and it makes awareness your responsibility. This story isn't an argument against commitment. It's an argument for mutual presence, for relationships where stability and desire coexist, where no one is quietly waiting to be chosen again. I didn't win anything by leaving. I didn't get revenge. I didn't prove my worth. What I gained was alignment, the quiet kind that lets you sleep without questions, that lets you trust your own perception again, that makes your calm feel like strength, not sacrifice. If you're listening to this and something feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know this. You don't need a dramatic reason to reassess your place in someone's life. You don't need permission to notice patterns, and you don't need to wait until resentment replaces clarity. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop waiting to be chosen and choose yourself without announcing it. I'll end this story with a question, not to provoke, but to reflect. Have you ever realized you were staying not because you were being chosen, but because you were convenient? If so, what would it look like to choose yourself, quietly, honestly, and without anger? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.